Imagine a 144-story building that stretches deep underground instead of up into the sky. A place where 10,000 people live without knowing why. The silo is not just a place. It is one of the main characters. In this video, we're going to see how this massive structure was designed, how it can fit 10,000 people inside, and how its different spaces are arranged across the different levels and connected to each other. I recreated the silo from the TV series in 3D. For this, I used the available information about the silo's architecture, as well as different shots from the series. Whenever accurate and official information wasn't available, I estimated the dimensions as closely as possible from the images in the series, so we can get a relatively accurate picture of the building's structure. We're going to talk about almost everything, from the architecture and design logic of the silo to its systems, different levels, important spaces, and how they are connected to each other. If you study architecture or design, there are a lot of details to discover here. And if you're not involved in architecture, after watching this video, you'll probably see the silo in a completely different way and understand the story better too. Hi, I'm Hossein and welcome to my YouTube channel. There's a lot to talk about, so without further ado, let's get into the silo. To get a clear picture of the silo, it's better to start with its overall scale. The silo is basically a vertical underground megastructure, a massive structure that goes deep into the ground instead of spreading across the surface. In the series, the silo has 144 levels and around 10,000 people live inside it. So in reality, we're dealing with a complete society that has continued living inside this enclosed space for generations. To better imagine the depth of the silo, it is usually estimated to be around 1 mile, or roughly 1.6 to 1.8 kilometers. Of course, this number is not exact, and depends on the actual height of each level. For comparison, the Empire State Building is about 400 meters tall, so the depth of the silo is roughly 4 times the height of that skyscraper. In other words, if we stacked several buildings of this size on top of each other, we'd only then get close to a scale that helps us imagine the depth of the silo. But what really makes the scale of the silo strange is not just its depth, its width is also enormous. Based on measurements I made from shots in the series and comparisons between the dimensions of different spaces, the overall diameter of the silo is probably somewhere between 150 and 200 meters. So we're not dealing with a narrow shaft, we're looking at a huge, multi-layered space that contains different parts of human life throughout all of this height. If we use these dimensions as our basis, each level would have an area of roughly 17,000 square meters, giving us a total floor area of around 2.5 million square meters across all 144 levels. Of course, these figures are not official plans published for the silo. Some are based on information shown in the series, while others are estimates from reconstruction and measurements based on the scenes we see. Human scale, staircases, interior spaces, and the relationships between different parts of the structure. Just to imagine the size of this structure, the amount of soil that would need to be removed to create such a massive space could reach tens of millions of cubic meters. In the model I reconstructed, I estimated this amount at around 28 million cubic meters. But here's the important part. These 144 levels are not 144 typical floors. Different parts of the silo have completely different functions, from residential and agricultural spaces to utilities, machinery, public areas, and administrative sections. That's why it makes more sense to think of the silo not as a 144-story building, but as a vertical city, a city that grows upward and deep into the ground instead of spreading across the surface. And almost the entire city is connected by one central element, the massive staircase of the silo, stretching from the highest levels all the way down to its deepest sections. Now that we have a better sense of the silo's overall scale, let's step inside this vertical city and see how its 144 levels are organized, and what role each section plays in keeping the silo running. Let's take a closer look at the geometry and structure of the building itself. One of the first things that stands out about the silo is the unusual height of each level. According to Hugh Howey, the author of the series, each level in the silo has a vertical module of about 40 feet, or around 12 meters. Of course, these 40 feet don't mean the clear height of the interior space. Around 10 feet of this height is dedicated to usable space, while the rest is between the levels and the structure. But when we enter a level itself, we're not looking at a 12-meter high empty space. In many parts of the silo, this main height is divided into several interior spaces. In the model I reconstructed, based on shots from the series, the most logical interpretation is that each main level can contain 3 interior floors, each with a floor-to-floor height of around 4 meters. These 3 floors are connected through stairs and paths within the same level, but this connection only happens within that level. To move to the next main level, people still have to use the silo's main vertical circulation system. Of course, this 3-floor pattern can't be confidently applied to every part of the silo. For example, the farms and agricultural spaces need much more height, so they naturally can't follow exactly the same division. In areas like Judicial, IT, or Administration, we also don't have enough visual information to say with certainty that the same pattern is used there. But based on the proportions we can see in the visible parts of the silo, using several interior levels in these areas can also be a reasonable interpretation. Now, if we move one step beyond the scale of the levels and look at the central part of the silo, we can get a few more numbers that help us understand the actual scale of this space. At the center of the silo, there is a central column or core with an approximate diameter of 2.5 meters. Around this core is the main spiral staircase, which I estimated to be about 3 meters wide in my model. This staircase has around 67 steps per level, and to move from one main level to the next, it makes roughly 1 full turn plus 1/3 of a turn around the core. So the vertical circulation of the silo isn't just a straight staircase. It's a very long spiral path that repeats through almost the entire height of the structure. On the other hand, there is also a very large empty space between the edge of the staircase and the inner shell of the silo. In the reconstructed model, I estimated this distance from the edge of the staircase to the interior spaces around the silo at around 10 to 12 meters. This distance makes the central void of the silo truly enormous. And when we place a person next to it, the scale of the space becomes much easier to understand. Each main level connects to the central staircase through paths that are approximately 1.8 meters wide. So, if we put all these dimensions together, we're looking at a very large central structure, a core of about 2.5 meters, a staircase around 3 meters wide, a multi-meter wide empty space around it, and then the interior spaces organized along the silo's outer shell. Of course, these numbers are not official published plans of the silo. These are dimensions I reached by using shots from the series, comparing the scale of different elements, and reconstructing the building in 3D. So they should be considered architectural estimates. But one thing that remains almost constant throughout the silo is its overall form. The silo has an almost completely circular and cylindrical structure. This isn't just an aesthetic decision. When you place a massive structure this deep underground, the pressure and forces acting on its walls from all sides become very important. A circular shape, because it has no sharp corners, allows stresses to be distributed more evenly around the structure. Structurally, this makes it a very logical form for a large underground space. In a rectangular plan, the corners can become areas of stress concentration, but in a circular section, the forces can be distributed along the curved walls. Of course, this doesn't mean a circle is the only possible shape. It's simply one of the most logical forms for these conditions. And in the silo, this form has also become an architectural language, because almost everything follows the same geometry. The levels are arranged as rings around the central core. The main staircase moves as a spiral around this core, and many of the interior paths and spaces repeat the same circular language. As a result, even when we only see part of the silo, the overall form of the building is still easy to understand. But Perhaps the most important geometric element of the silo is the central empty space itself. Almost the entire organisation of the building is built around a central open core, a space around which the massive staircase of the silo moves, with bridges and circulation paths connecting to it. Hugh Howey has also talked about the importance of the central shaft, the staircase, and the bridges between different sections when discussing the design of the silo. And the version created for the series follows this original idea to a large extent. So this central space isn't just a large void. In fact, it's the spatial backbone of the silo. All the levels, circulation paths, and a major part of the building's visual experience are shaped around this empty space. And there's an important architectural point here. When a building has 144 levels, circulation is no longer just a matter of access. It becomes part of the architecture itself. In a typical building, you simply move from one floor to another. But in the silo, you're actually moving between different parts of a vertical city. A city where different functions, environments, and even social groups are located at different heights. That's why the geometry of the silo isn't just about circles, dimensions, and structural logic. This geometry directly shapes how people move, and therefore how people live inside the silo. And now that we understand this geometric structure, we can move on to the most important part of this system. How do people move through a city like this? Why is there no elevator? And how did the central staircase become one of the most important social elements of the silo? One of the strangest features of the silo is that despite all the technology and complexity inside it, the vertical transportation system for its residents relies heavily on one walking route, the central staircase. This staircase moves as a massive spiral around the central space of the silo, connecting the different levels. In the series, we also see that this path isn't only used by people. People, goods, and different types of equipment are constantly moving along it. If we consider the roughly 12-meter height of each level, it becomes clear that moving between different parts of the silo is not easy. Just moving from one main level to the next means travelling around 12 meters vertically, and as the distance between two destinations increases, the route becomes significantly longer. So, unlike a typical building, moving between different parts of the silo isn't something people can do easily without thinking about it. And this is what makes the staircase more than just a connection between different levels. It also becomes part of the social system of the silo. When moving around is time-consuming and difficult, people are less likely to travel between different sections. As a result, groups living at different heights tend to remain within their own areas. This is also reinforced by the way the different functions of the silo are organised. Areas like mechanical are located in the lower sections. Agriculture spreads across the middle sections, while management and administrative functions are located higher up. So the difference in height isn't just a geometric difference. Over time, it also becomes a difference in people's environment, type of work, and social groups. Of course, we should distinguish between an architectural result and a design intention. The idea that elevators were intentionally removed for the purpose of social control is not something the series confirms as an architectural fact. But if we look at the silo from the perspective of architecture and urban systems, the result of this decision is quite significant. If there were a fast transportation system between the levels, communication between different sections would become much easier. People would move around more easily, information would travel faster, and the social distance between different groups would become smaller. But the silo doesn't rely only on the staircase to move goods and information. This is where a specific group of workers becomes part of the system, the porters. Porters can be seen as a kind of human transportation system within the silo. They move goods, letters, equipment, and different supplies between the different sections, and they spend a significant amount of their time on these vertical routes. So the staircase isn't just a path for people, it's also part of the silo's internal circulation network. Food, goods, equipment, waste, and other resources constantly need to move between different sections. Alongside pipes, utilities, and other infrastructure, the porters also form part of this complex distribution system. From this perspective, The silo is a vertical city whose transportation system relies less on elevators and vehicles and more on a human and pedestrian network. But the result of this system isn't just transportation. In a typical city, geographical distance can lead to the formation of neighborhoods and the separation of different groups. In the silo, that same distance is created vertically. The higher or lower you go, the more the environment, type of work, and social groups around you change. So the central staircase creates an interesting paradox in the silo. On one hand, it connects the entire society together. But on the other hand, the difficulty of using this path means that this connection is never completely free or constant. And this is one of the most important architectural ideas in the silo. Architecture isn't designed only to protect people from the outside world. It also shapes how they move, communicate, and live with each other inside the silo. While I was studying the silo for this video, I came across a few things that I found a little strange, and I still haven't been able to find a definite answer for them. One of the most interesting ones is related to this central staircase. If you look closely at the image of the silo we see in the opening credits of the series, the connections between the central staircase and the levels seem to be arranged in a six-way pattern. In fact, each level has one connection, but there are 6 possible connection points. But when we look at the different spaces of the silo throughout the series, what we see more often is a 3-way pattern. 3 paths or connections positioned at 120-degree angles from each other, creating something that looks a bit like the Mercedes-Benz logo in plan. So the question is, where exactly does this difference come from? Is it simply a mistake or an inconsistency in the set design, or is there actually an architectural or story-related reason behind it? There is even a possibility that the image we see in the opening credits isn't actually Silo 18. I still haven't found a definite answer myself, so if you know anything about this, let me know in the comments. I'd really like to know where this difference comes from. If you've been enjoying the video so far, make sure to like it and let me know what you think about the series and the silo itself in the comments. Also, let me know if you'd like me to make more videos in this style about the architecture of famous buildings, movies, and TV shows. And if so, which building should I cover next? And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure to do that and turn on the notifications. It really helps me continue making this kind of content. Alright, let's get back to the silo. Now that we know the overall structure of the silo, it's time to start from the top and see how these 144 levels come together to form a vertical city. The silo isn't a building made up of 144 identical floors. As we move down along the vertical axis, the function, appearance of the spaces, and even the social groups around us change. If we look at it in a very general way, we can divide the silo into 3 main zones: up top, mids, and down deep. In up top, we mostly find administrative, governmental, and management spaces. In mids, the daily life of most residents takes place. And finally, in down deep, we enter the industrial and mechanical areas. Now let's start from the highest level and move downward. On level 1, we find one of the most important public spaces in the silo, the cafeteria. There's a large screen here that continuously displays an image of the outside world. During a cleaning, many residents gather in this space to watch the event. Next to the cafeteria is the main sheriff station, and access to the airlock is also located in this area. This is where people chosen for a cleaning are sent out to the surface. But after level 1, we don't immediately enter a completely different environment. The early levels of the silo are mostly part of up top and include a collection of administrative, service, and public spaces that aren't all fully introduced in the series. One of the next important points is level 14, where Judicial is located. Judicial is responsible for enforcing the laws and maintaining order in the silo, so its location in the upper sections fits well with the social role of this area. Between level 1 and level 14, there is actually a significant vertical distance, around 13 levels, which forms part of the larger public and administrative structure of up top. So level 14 shouldn't be seen as an isolated floor. It's better understood as one of the important points within a larger zone. A little lower, on level 19, we reach one of the silo's most important centers of power, IT. The main IT offices are located on this level, and the department is managed by Bernard Holland. IT isn't just a normal office. The cameras, computer systems, and a major part of the silo's information infrastructure are controlled from here. Even the power source for IT is different from the silo's main power system and comes from a separate source, something that itself becomes one of the major mysteries of the story. So, if Judicial represents legal power, IT can be seen as one of the main centres of information power in the silo. Between level 19 and the middle sections of the silo, the scale and functions of the spaces gradually change. Here, we enter an area that is more focused on the everyday lives of the residents. Apartments, public services, medical centres, markets, and different social spaces are located throughout this section. One important example is the MIDS Medical Centre, which we see residents visiting several times throughout the series. So, as we move away from the upper levels, the silo gradually changes from a centre of power and administration into an urban environment, a place where most of the daily life of the people takes place. In this same area, one of the important points is the mill on level 59. The mill isn't just a single industrial space, it's part of the silo's food production and processing system, and its presence within this area shows that production activities are also integrated into the urban fabric of the silo. But between level 59 and the lower sections, the architectural language gradually changes. The further down we go, the more industrial the spaces become, and the more visible the infrastructure of the silo becomes. This is where we start moving toward down deep. There are also agricultural spaces in the lower sections. In Silo 18, at least 2 agricultural areas can be seen on level 80 and level 122. The large distance between these 2 agricultural areas is interesting because it shows that food production isn't limited to a single location. It's distributed across different heights of the silo. Here, we also need to keep one thing in mind. We don't have enough information about every level between these points to determine its exact function. So we shouldn't think of the silo's map as a list of 144 separate uses. What we can identify with more confidence are the larger functional zones and the important points within them. Eventually, as we move further down, we enter the territory of mechanical. Socially, mechanical is located in one of the lowest parts of the silo. But functionally, it's one of the most critical areas of the entire complex. The machinery, maintenance, and major infrastructure of the silo are located here, and any disruption to its operation can affect the entire community. This contrast is one of the interesting aspects of the silo's spatial organization. The area that sits at the bottom of the social hierarchy is functionally one of the most important parts of the entire society. But level 144 isn't the true end of the silo. Level 144 is the lowest official level of the silo, and directly beneath it is a massive concrete slab around 30 feet, or nearly 9 meters, thick. But below this slab, a huge cylindrical space continues downward. Inside this space, the machines used to construct the silo are still there. This is the silo's hidden cavern. At the bottom of this underground space, there is a layer of water, and a mysterious tunnel continues through it toward a large metal door. This is where the vertical structure of the silo enters its hidden section. Up to this point, we've been looking at a vertical city divided from top to bottom into public, administrative, residential, production, and industrial spaces. But the cavern shows that even below the area that residents know as the end of the silo, there are spaces that don't exist on the official map of their society. In Season 2, we also discover that this isn't limited to a hidden space inside a single silo. The connection between different silos is part of a much larger structure within this world. So if we look at the silo's map from top to bottom, we're not looking at a simple sequence of floors. We're looking at a collection of functional and social zones organized along the vertical axis. Up top, the center of power and administration, mids, the main area of everyday life and activity, and down deep, the realm of production, infrastructure, and mechanical. And beneath all of this is the cavern, a space that shows us that the real map of the silo may be much larger and more complex than its residents know. Imagine that from the day you're born until the end of your life, you never see a real sky, a street, a sunrise or sunset, or a window looking out into the world. Your home is a concrete space, hundreds of meters underground, and the boundaries of your world aren't streets or natural landscapes. They're the walls and massive structure of the silo. And yet, the interior architecture of the silo tries to recreate the feeling of a normal life as much as possible. The apartments are usually relatively simple spaces, but unlike the industrial and public areas, there is an effort to create a warmer and more personal environment inside them. Each family has its own space, and despite the severe limitations, people have personal belongings, furniture, photographs, and objects that make these spaces feel more like homes than rooms inside an underground shelter. But one of the biggest things lost in this environment is natural light. The residents of the silo don't experience a real cycle of day and night. Because of this, artificial lighting isn't just there to illuminate the spaces. It's part of the everyday experience of life in the silo. The lighting needs to create an environment that doesn't feel too much like an industrial underground space, while also creating a predictable rhythm for daily life. This isn't only important from an architectural perspective, it also matters psychologically. Humans naturally connect with changes in light, the time of day, and visual contact with the outside environment. When that connection is removed for a long period of time, interior architecture has to compensate for some of that loss through artificial light, colour, spatial scale, and the creation of social environments. And perhaps the silo's strangest solution for connecting with the outside world is the same thing we saw on level 1, the massive cafeteria screen. This screen isn't a real window, but for the residents, it plays a role similar to a kind of collective window. Instead of seeing the outside world, an image of the outside is brought inside. And this creates one of the most interesting contradictions in the architecture of the silo. People live inside a completely enclosed building, while the architecture constantly tries to bring an image of the world they've been separated from back into their everyday lives. So the problem of the silo isn't simply about creating a safe place to survive, it's about how to make living in such an environment possible and bearable. And this is where we see the difference between a shelter and a city. A shelter can provide a person's basic needs for a limited amount of time, but the silo has to do something much more complicated. It has to make it possible for an entire society to live for years, and even for generations. People have to live, work, eat food, use water, get sick, produce waste, and put used resources back into the cycle of life. So behind these simple apartments and seemingly ordinary spaces, there is a massive and complex infrastructure. And this is where the main question comes in. How can around 10,000 people live inside an underground structure for generations? Building a city like this requires much more than homes, staircases, and public spaces. It needs reliable systems for water, air, food, energy, and waste management. And most importantly, these systems have to keep working not just for a few days or a few years, but for generations. First of all, air. The silo is essentially a closed environment, and its entire design is based on the assumption that the outside air is not safe for humans to breathe. So unlike a typical building, you can't simply open a window and let fresh air inside. As a result, ventilation is one of the most critical infrastructures in the silo. Air has to constantly move through the building, be filtered, and then return to the cycle of use. This is where the central void of the silo becomes interesting. This massive space with the staircase moving around it could potentially also play a role in air movement from an architectural perspective. The temperature difference across such a large vertical height could create something similar to the stack effect, helping air move vertically. Of course, the series doesn't directly confirm that this shaft was designed as a natural ventilation system, so it's better to consider this an engineering possibility rather than a confirmed fact about the silo. The next issue is water. A community of 10,000 people uses a huge amount of water every day for drinking, washing, agriculture, industry, and many other activities. So the silo can't rely only on an initial water supply. To maintain life in such a closed environment, a significant amount of the water that is used would have to be treated and returned to the cycle. The exact details of this system aren't fully explained in the series. For example, we don't know exactly how human wastewater is treated. But from an engineering perspective, the more self-sufficient the silo is, the more important water recycling becomes. The same logic applies to waste. In a closed environment, you can't simply move waste outside like you would in a normal city. Some materials need to be reused or recycled, while the remaining waste has to be removed from the cycle in a controlled way. This becomes even more important when we look at agriculture. The silo isn't just a place to live. It also produces some of its own food. There are farms and agricultural spaces throughout different sections, and in the story we see indoor growing systems and dedicated areas for food production. In such an environment, methods like hydroponics could make sense because they allow crops to be produced with more precise control over water and space. But agriculture deep underground has one major problem: light. Plants need light to grow, and there is no direct sunlight inside the silo. So if agriculture is going to operate on a significant scale, part of the silo's energy has to be used for artificial lighting in the growing areas. We can even see the importance of this in the series itself, where the loss or shortage of critical equipment like lamps can become a serious threat to the survival and stability of the entire silo. And this brings us to the next major infrastructure: energy. At the lowest sections of the silo is mechanical, which is the technical and industrial heart of the complex. At the center of this area is a massive generator, and a large part of the silo's operation depends on it. When the generator has a problem, it's not just the lights that go out. Water pumps, ventilation systems, medical equipment, agriculture, communications, and almost every critical infrastructure system depend on energy. As for the generator's exact energy source, the series gives us information about a steam system and the infrastructure connected to it, but it doesn't explain the complete energy generation cycle in scientific or engineering detail. So we can't say with certainty that the silo is actually a geothermal power plant in the strict sense, or that all of its energy comes from this system. But one thing is completely clear: the entire community depends on a centralized energy generation system. And that dependence is both the silo's greatest strength and one of its biggest weaknesses, because the systems in this building don't operate independently. They depend on each other. If the power goes out, the pumps stop. If the pumps stop, the water and wastewater systems start having problems. If ventilation stops, air quality decreases. If agriculture doesn't have enough water or light, food production is affected. In other words, a failure in one system can quickly spread to other parts of the silo. In reality, the silo is a network of interconnected systems. Air depends on energy, water depends on pumping, agriculture depends on water and light, and almost all of these systems ultimately depend on the energy infrastructure. That's why when we look at the silo, we shouldn't just see a massive building. We're actually looking at an artificial ecosystem, a system that has to provide almost every need of an entire society within a closed environment. And there's another important issue here. The more complex this system becomes, the more potential points of failure it has. The silo depends on thousands of components: pumps, motors, pipes, cables, filters, generators, and control systems. So the challenge isn't just building all of this infrastructure. The real challenge is maintaining it for generations. And this is exactly where mechanical becomes so important. Because if we think of this vertical city as a living organism, mechanical is where a large part of its vital systems are concentrated. So far, we've seen how the silo is built, how it's organized, and how it works. But now we have a different question. Why was this architecture designed this way? If we look at the silo from an architectural perspective, one of its most important features is that almost nothing about it feels accidental. The form, scale, materials, lighting, and even the way people move through the building all serve one common idea: creating an artificial environment that can hold an entire society without ever letting us forget that we are living inside a massive enclosed structure. Unlike many science fiction buildings, the silo doesn't try to show the future with shiny surfaces, glass, flashy technology, or complex forms. Quite the opposite. Here, the architecture is heavy, repetitive, industrial, and to a large extent, harsh. And this choice is one of the most important parts of the silo's visual identity. Architecture that isn't meant to look beautiful. When we look at the interior of the silo, we usually see concrete, metal, pipes, exposed structures, and surfaces that make little effort to hide their industrial nature. This visual language is quite close to brutalism. Of course, the silo isn't a real brutalist building in the historical sense, but it uses the visual language of brutalism. In brutalism, the materials, mass, and structure of a building are usually not hidden. In the silo, concrete isn't just a construction material, it becomes part of the story itself. The heavy and raw surfaces remind us that this isn't a normal home or city, it's a survival infrastructure, a building that has to last for centuries and isn't supposed to change with the trends or tastes of its residents. That's why the architecture of the silo communicates less of a feeling of comfort and freedom and more a feeling of durability, limitation, and permanence. Architecture as a social language. But this language doesn't exist only at the scale of the entire building. As we move through the silo, we notice that the quality of the architecture constantly changes. One area might be cleaner, brighter, and more formal. Another might feel more crowded, worn down, and industrial. These differences aren't just there to make the scenes look more interesting. Through architecture, the silo tells us where we are and who lives or works here. In fact, the social hierarchy doesn't only exist on the map, it's written into the spaces themselves. Without anyone telling us what status an area has, we can often guess it from the quality of the materials, lighting, cleanliness, wear, and architectural details. This is where architecture becomes a language. Scale, humans versus the machine. Another important feature is the contrast between human scale and structural scale. When we see a person next to the massive staircase, the long bridges, or walls that are several meters high, we finally begin to understand the true size of the silo. This contrast feels very intentional, because if every element of a space is close to human scale, even a very large structure can feel small in our minds. But when we place a small human figure next to massive infrastructure, our brains can understand the actual size of the space much better. In the silo, this also has a narrative meaning. The human is supposed to look small compared to the building, because this building wasn't made for humans. Humans are part of a much larger system. Order versus confusion. On the other hand, the silo has an interesting contradiction. Geometrically, the building is extremely organized and repetitive. The levels, vertical axis, staircase, and circular organization all form a clear system. But the experience of living inside this system isn't necessarily organized. You might travel hundreds of meters, cross bridges, enter different corridors, and still not have a complete picture of where you are. This creates an interesting contrast. The building is readable geometrically, but it can be confusing from a human perspective. And this is important to the story, because the residents of the silo live inside a very organized system, but they don't necessarily know the entire system. Everyone knows only a part of the building. One person lives in mechanical, another lives in the residential areas, another works in IT, another works in the administrative sections, and each of them experiences only one piece of this massive city. So architecture indirectly creates a limitation on information too. You can live inside a building and still not really understand how it works. Architecture that tells the story. And perhaps this is one of the most important features of its design. In many movies and TV shows, architecture is simply a backdrop to the story. Characters move through buildings, but the spaces themselves rarely influence or shape the narrative. In the silo, things are completely different. Here, architecture is part of the story. Height creates distance. The staircase makes movement difficult. The levels separate the society. The materials show differences in status. The scale reminds us how small humans are compared to the system. And even the central void makes it possible to constantly imagine this entire society within one shared vertical axis. So if I had to summarize the architectural philosophy of the silo in one sentence, it might be this. The silo isn't a building that was simply created to tell the story. The building itself is part of the the story. And perhaps that's why the more we study the plans and architecture of the silo, the more we realize that the story isn't just about people living inside a building. It's about how a building can shape people's lives, their social relationships, and even what they know about the world they live in. But before we move away from the silo, there's an interesting question. Does anything like the silo actually exist in our world? Of course, there is no structure with the same scale, depth, and social organization as the silo. But when we look at real examples, we can see that almost all of its main ideas have real examples in architecture or engineering. The first example is the underground city of Derinkuyu in Turkey. Derinkuyu is part of the network of underground cities in Cappadocia. It was built across several levels underground, with spaces for living, storage, religious activities, and circulation. The main similarity with the silo isn't simply that both are underground. The more important similarity is how human life is organized when access to the surface is limited. When natural light, views to the outside, and horizontal space aren't available, architecture has to organize different functions within a compact, multi-layered system. But there is a major difference. Derinkuyu gradually developed within the natural rock structure, while the silo was designed from the beginning as an integrated, engineered megastructure. Derinkuyu is an example of how humans can live within the ground. The silo takes this idea and turns it into a complete, fully planned city. The second example is Cubapedi in Australia. Here we're not dealing with an underground city in the traditional sense. A significant number of living spaces were created inside underground excavations, but the reason for this choice is completely different from the silo: climate. The extremely high temperatures at the surface have led residents to use the thermal mass of the ground to create a more stable environment. In other words, the ground itself becomes part of the building's functional system, a massive thermal mass that helps regulate temperature. This example teaches us an important point. The ground isn't just a place to hide a building, the ground itself can become part of the architecture. In Cubapedi, this is mainly a climate solution. In the silo, the ground also plays a structural and protective role, while becoming part of the system's security and separation from the outside world. The third example is the Greenbrier Bunker in West Virginia, USA. This facility was built during the Cold War as a secret shelter for the United States Congress. Here, the issue isn't simply living underground, it's about keeping an entire facility functioning during a crisis. Ventilation, communications, energy, water, living spaces, and access routes all have to work together. This is where the similarity with the silo becomes much stronger. But there is one major difference. Greenbrier was designed for temporary survival during an emergency. The silo is designed for permanent life. This may be the most important difference between a bunker and the silo. In a shelter, you can store enough food and water for a certain period of time. But if an entire society is going to live inside a closed environment for generations, food has to be produced, water has to be recycled, waste has to be managed, and beyond the technical infrastructure, there also need to be schools, healthcare, work, administration, and social life. This is where the silo moves away from the concept of a bunker and becomes an artificial city. The fourth example is modern survival shelters. One well-known example is Vivos X Point in South Dakota, a complex of concrete shelters developed on a former military site. Here again, we're dealing with infrastructure designed for survival during extreme conditions, but its spatial organization is completely different. The complex is made up mostly of a large number of independent units. The silo, on the other hand, is a vertical and integrated system. Inside the silo, you can't simply separate one unit from the rest of the system. Water, energy, ventilation, food production, transportation, and even the social structure all depend on a shared network. So what is the silo, really? If we put all these examples together, each one shows us a different part of what it means to live underground. Derinkuyu shows us how an entire community can be organized beneath the ground. Cubapedi shows us how the ground itself can become part of a building's climate system. Greenbrier shows us how infrastructure can be designed to keep people alive during a crisis. And modern underground shelters try to combine some of these ideas with today's technology. But what the silo does is combine these ideas into a self-sufficient underground city. And perhaps this is the best definition. The silo isn't really an underground building. It's a city that has moved the entire logic of a city underground. Homes, agriculture, industry, energy, administration, law, transportation, and social life are all contained within one vertical and enclosed structure. And this is what makes the silo interesting when we compare it with real-world examples. We realize that its basic idea isn't actually that unrealistic. The silo isn't something completely imaginary. It's an imaginary combination of solutions that in many cases have already been tested in the real world. So this was a look at the architecture of the silo, from its overall form and structure to circulation, levels, infrastructure, and life inside this megastructure. What I found interesting while studying the silo is that when we look at it from an architectural perspective, many details that might seem like simple parts of the set design at first actually help build this underground world. Of course, some of the dimensions and details you saw in this video were estimated based on shots from the series, available information, and architectural analysis. They are not necessarily the official plans from the creators. I tried to put together all the information that was available and reconstruct as closely as possible a logical representation of the silo from the series. If you have more information about any part of the silo, or if you noticed any inconsistencies, definitely let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy this type of video, let me know what other building or fictional world you'd like me to explore from an architectural perspective. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure to do that. Thank you for staying with me until the end. See you in the next video. Goodbye.